Hey everyone, and welcome to Risky Business. My name's Patrick Gray. We're going to get into the news section in just a moment with Adam Boileau, and then we'll be hearing from this week's sponsor, Trail of Bits. So Trail of Bits, Dan Guido will be joining us this week, and they're a security engineering firm, and they've been participating in the DARPA AI challenge, right? And they just had a round of this at Defcon, and he's going to join us to walk through, what people were able to show off during that round, and, just talk a little bit about using AI and large language models to do vulnerability discovery and also patching. So that's a very interesting interview, and it's coming up a little bit later on. But first up, of course, we're joined by Adam Boileau. G'day, mate.
Yeah, top of the morning to you, sir.
All right, so let's get into it now. And is this a case of here we go again? Because it looks like Iranian government hackers, Iranian crews, have apparently obtained a whole bunch of stolen material from the Trump campaign and are leaking it to the press, right? So everybody's like, oh my God, it's 2016 all over again, election interference and whatever. I don't think this is going to move the needle a millimeter, and I guess we'll get into that in a moment. But what is your feeling on all of this?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it brings back some bad memories of the mess that happened in the previous round of elections with, butter emails and all of the, Hillary's email servers in Ukraine and all the other complete madness. But as you say, like the US election has so many other things going on that I feel like, even if if Iranians did want to influence the election, like they're probably better just sitting out and watching it in horror like the rest of us, rather than, actively trying to put a finger on the scale. And it sounds like in this case, they compromised. I think there was some suggestion that maybe it was Roger Stone, and then used his former Trump kind of associate advisor, and then used his email to email people at the Trump campaign, presumably fish them, for either code exec or creds, and then onwards to stealing documents and passing them off to the media. That seems to be the story.
Former Trump associate and Batman villain Roger Stone was involved in this. So it looks like they got his email account, loaded it up with, phishing links and whatever, and started sending it out to people in the Trump campaign. There's a few interesting elements to this one. I think one interesting part of this is that the press so far hasn't really reported on this stuff. I think another interesting difference between now and 2016 is this doesn't have novelty. They're not, we're used to the idea that foreign states are going to do this. So while the Guccifer 2.0, persona held, at least in some people's minds for a little bit, I think we've all sort of moved beyond that now. Yeah. And, just the media generally being a little bit responsible about this. I have a feeling, though, if it was a leak from the Democratic side, Newsmax would be running stories about, how, Kamala Harris is an alien or whatever, so I think there is, there's a few differences. And I think really, sadly, one of the differences is, which side it's targeted, but also what's going to happen? A leak's going to embarrass Donald Trump? The man cannot be embarrassed, right? So I understand why people are getting tense over this, but I really do feel like this is not, this will be someone shot at Donald Trump a couple of weeks ago, and everyone seems to have already forgotten about it, right? So I think this is going to just disappear out of the news cycle and not make a difference to anything.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's just this whole campaign is so bonkers that foreign hack and leak is just not even it's just pocket lint,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I did hear, someone who tracks these sorts of groups suggested to me that this is less about trying to interfere in the election and achieve a certain outcome as it is about personally kind of going after Trump, right? Because the Iranians definitely have a bone to pick with him after he turned, Qasem Soleimani into paste. So, they hate him, right? So, you do maybe get the impression that this is more about the Iranians trying to do stuff to just annoy Trump rather than aiming for a specific outcome in the election,
What a world, man. What a world.
It is. IRC wars is statecraft, right? So,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I've linked through to Catalin Kimpanu's write up on that. He's our colleague, and he did a good job on that one. And so the FBI is investigating that one, and Microsoft has warned that there's that Iranian hackers are ramping up election interference. But, you know, again, I just don't see this going anywhere. But yeah, we'll have to wait and see. Interestingly enough, the State Department in the United States has put out a $10 million bounty on a different set of Iranian hackers. So there's like lots of Iran news at the moment. And I really feel like by the time we're all talking about a threat actor having arrived at a certain level of status, they've already been there for a while. But it certainly looks like these days Iran is, shall we say, good at the cybers.
Yes, this was the group that's been hacking like control systems, embedded control systems, like screens, for example, to display messages about Israel. And I think it's part of the Revolutionary Guard, so like part of the government, but kind of poses as a hacktivist group, even though presumably they're just people who work day jobs, you know, at desks like everybody else in the military there. So, you know, we've seen them doing this for a while, but yeah, as you say, Iran is definitely getting a bunch of attention because, you know, it kind of dovetails well with other stories around the region and all of the other stuff that's going on there as well.
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, that election interference is like sort of passé, doesn't have a novelty anymore, and just as government hackers posing as hacktivists these days is just workaday, right? Like I remember when it, you know, the first couple of big ones around that, you were talking about the Sony Pictures hack when you had Guardians of Peace, right? Which was the North Koreans. You had, and before that, you had the huge attack against Saudi Aramco. That was Iran, I think, wasn't it? And that was what do they call themselves? Yeah, the cutting sword of justice, which is, you know,
that. And then the Russians versus the Winter Olympics in South Korea. Was that the one where they pretended to be hacktivists?
Well, yeah, and then Gucci for two. You know, I'm a lone hacker who doesn't like Hillary or whatever. So yeah, crazy times. But yeah, certainly Iran. Definitely, you know, Iran and North Korea, they used to be, of the big four, Russia, China, Iran and North Korea, they used to be the sort of laggards. And these days, you know, I don't know, they're doing it. They're giving it a go, Adam.
They certainly are, yes.
Yeah. So we got some interesting comments here out of Jen Easterly, the director of CISA in the United States. I found this interesting because she is saying something that we said, which is that when the CrowdStrike event happened, you know, the first thing I thought of is like, well, this is kind of the type of effect that the Chinese would be going for around something like Vault Typhoon. And indeed, she's come out and said that, you know, this is a great dress rehearsal to understand what those sort of things might look like. One thing I do find interesting, though, and this comes back to that whole discussion that we regularly have about, you know, the concept of cyber war. Ultimately, it inconvenienced a bunch of travelers. But no one's still thinking of, like, the average person on the street is not still thinking about the CrowdStrike outage at this point. Like, it is something that happened, it's done, we've moved on, it was a mess, you know. So you do sort of wonder, well, how much more effective could a campaign like Vault Typhoon, which is a multi-year, multi-stage, highly coordinated campaign, could it even get to the level of effectiveness of something like the CrowdStrike outage, right? And you know, how does this change the way we think about these issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, when the CrowdStrike thing was happening and it started to become clear that it was, you know, just common garden screw up and not, you know, cyber attack, and that it was in the kernel and that it caused things to you know, blue screen during boot, you know, there was quite a few conversations about, like, you know, what if this was actually Vault Typhoon? What if it was really malicious? Because you had all the ingredients there. Like, if you did all the things CrowdStrike did, but then also bricked all the machine's hardware, like bricked the firmware so they couldn't boot up anymore, that would not have been over so quickly. And that's kind of like, if you were going to do this as a nation state, it has become clear that just making things not boot in software is not good enough, because we recovered from the CrowdStrike, you know, in the end, in the matter of a few days. But if you bricked every motherboard, like, and in a way that required, you know, physical replacement, it would not take days. Like, that would be a much, much more severe thing. And I guess what this has shown us is that the bar for causing wide-scale disruption is pretty high. And if you're going to do it, you know, you need to do it for serious. You can't muck around with just, you know, brick and windows. You got to do it properly. Yeah,
I'm with you, but I still think, to a degree, fears of what an adversary might do, you know, full-scale cyber war, might be a little bit overblown. Like, I'm sure they can make a mess, but what you describe in terms of, like, perma-bricking, like, so imagine it's like deploying some sort of crypto or some sort of destructive thing. I don't know. Could the Chinese send a plant to work at Crowdstrike for years to, get into a trusted position where they can deploy, a crypto into their kernel code or something? I don't know. It just feels like you can construct all of these hypotheticals, but we always find a way. I mean, there were Indian Airlines through the Crowdstrike thing that were handwriting boarding passes, right? Yeah. Like, we always find a way, I guess is the point. But I think what Eastleigh says is right, which is like, this is what it could look like, right? And we now have a bit of a dress rehearsal.
Yeah, I think we do. And it's a good reminder why the US Gov has been making so much noise around Vault Typhoon, like why they've been specifically keeping that in the conversation, compared to everything else they could be talking about, because, we need to learn some lessons so that we are ready for the real deal.
Yeah. We have to give a shout out to Crowdstrike president Mike Santonis, though. He's actually an Australian guy who's the president there these days. He actually turned up to Defcon to accept the Pwnie Award for most epic fail. So,
yeah, and like that award was huge. It was ginormous when they brought it up.
They gave him
stage,
an extra big trophy for him for that one. Yeah,
but I mean, good on them for being good sports and getting up there and taking it on the chin and saying, "Hey, yes, we screwed up. We're going to do better," and not, running away from that. So yeah, good.
Yeah. We're going to spend a bit of time today too recapping some of the more interesting research that came out of Vegas, but we've got a few out of Blackhat and Defcon, which were held in Vegas, over the last week. But before that, we do have a few more news items to get through. One is that there's been a massive DDoS attack apparently targeting the Kursk region of Russia. This is, of course, where Ukraine has, essentially invaded Russian territory and this appears to be, at least for now, holding it. But I guess this is just one more example of what it looks like when contemporary militaries use cyber as part of their toolkit. And I think that's one thing we've really seen this over and over in Ukraine, that those DDoS attacks tend to roll in as part of a military campaign. I'm not sure what they actually achieve, but we can certainly say that this is now something that militaries do.
Yeah, it seems to be, as you say, like kind of table stakes for modern combat to, follow up with, combined arms in the cyberspace. Over on Between Two Nerds, there's been so many conversations on that podcast that we run about what even is cyber war, does it work, is it useful, and what do attacks like this mean? And I'm sure we will hear, Gruk and Tom offer their opinions on this as well, because like it didn't feel like it did much, but then again, we're not there. But we're not on the ground in Kursk, so maybe it did cause more impact, maybe it didn't. Who knows?
Yeah. So that piece is by Darina Antonik over at The Record. Links to everything, as usual, are in the show notes. Now, let's talk about another DDoS attack. Adam, politically motivated. Now, you and I were talking this morning. You are not anywhere near Twitter or X or whatever you want to call it these days. You just, had enough, gone, right?
Yeah,
I'm hanging around.
Spread over to Mastodon.
Yeah. I mean, I'm on Mastodon, but I remain on Twitter. I'm going to be there till the bitter end because I get enjoyment out of the chaos, to be honest. I mean, there's all sorts of revolting people on there. I don't think anyone should advertise on the platform, but you can see some crazy stuff on there sometimes. And yesterday was one of those days where Elon Musk had his big interview with Donald Trump. Oh, I think he wanted to call it a conversation because I'm not an interviewer, that's a loaded term. So he wanted to do a conversation with Donald Trump, and they had technical difficulties, of course, which, funnily enough, Elon Musk says there appears to be a massive DDoS attack on X, working on shutting it down. Worst case, we will proceed with a smaller number of live listeners and post the conversation later. And then someone replied, it's Dems fighting to, quote unquote, save democracy from two massive disruptors. Musk replies, yeah. So actually claiming a DDoS attack that no one seems to have observed. It looks like straight up technical problems. The other funny technical one in this is that Donald Trump appeared to be speaking with quite a pronounced lisp at various points during the interview, which his camp later came out and blamed on the Space's audio compression algorithm. And I got to say, man, I've been doing this a long time. I've never compressed audio and my audio and wound up sounding like Daffy Duck.
I mean, you might mess with me on occasion to make me sound a little bit funny, but
Yes.
no, it just, oh yeah, what?
So I'm just saying, there's still some good times to be had on Twitter, right?
I'm willing to throw that baby out with the bathwater. I think just
that's fine. I'll just tell you what happened there. It's cool.
Yeah, you can function as my Twitter secretary who observes the interesting stuff and tells me about it. So
I'll be your Twitter proxy, right? Like that's that's fine. Now, in some more serious news, Progress Software, which of course is the software company that owns MoveIt, which was subject to data extortion attacks. We all know about all of that. For a while it looked like they were being investigated by the SEC. Progress itself has come out now and said that it's not expecting any sort of enforcement action from the SEC. And of course, this comes just after a federal court in the United States dismissed parts of the SEC's civil fraud case against SolarWinds. And we've got a report here from David Jones at Cybersecurity Dive. I'm not quite sure if Progress's confidence in this case is because of the federal court finding that said that the SEC doesn't really have the power to regulate companies' cybersecurity controls in the same way it can regulate their accounting. But either way, it looks like as far as the SEC is concerned, Progress is kind of off the hook. That said, they're still facing a deluge of lawsuits and other regulatory actions from like the FTC and whatnot. I just found this an interesting story because, we're really discovering, I think the SEC is trying to get more aggressive, and they're starting to find their limits, right, of what they can do.
Yeah, because I mean, their job as a market regulator, it interacts with how people report their cyber issues and their controls and what they say about their companies, but it's still not 100% in their bailiwick to be able to do some of the things they have tried to. And I guess they're finding their feet in terms of the cybers. And as you say, Progress may, get off the hook this time, but they've got so many other problems going on. Like I think when we reported about this, when Kettles had wrote up for Riskkeepers News, he also noted that, in the same breath, they're out there patching bugs in one of their other products that's being actively exploited. And, they are far from fixed.
Yeah. I mean, I just find the SEC angle on this pretty interesting. And, I have found over the last few years, like US regulators are getting much more active in terms of trying to punish the wicked, shall we say.
Yeah, and good on them, because, there are certainly some people who are doing this stuff pretty wrong.
Yeah. Now, meanwhile, speaking of punishing the wicked, Advanced, which is a company that provides IT services to healthcare providers in the United Kingdom, they were a software supplier to the NHS. And, a big part of that ransomware attack that hit the NHS, when was that? 2022. Yeah, 2 years ago now. Wow. Feels like yesterday. They've been fined £6 million for failing to protect the personal information of tens of thousands of people. This is a story by Alexander Martin at The Record. And it looks like really what this boils down to is that they weren't applying multi-factor authentication to some pretty powerful accounts. And that's what earned them this fine. And I got to say, I think that's a positive thing, because I don't think there's any excuse for not applying MFA to these types of accounts, right? And I think getting whacked with a fine is the sort of thing that executives at similar companies are going to pay attention to.
Yeah, I think that it's making it clear that multi-factor is not an optional control. Like, it's a thing. If you're doing business over the internet, you provided these services as a service, that you have to have robust authentication, because it isn't so much of what we have thought about these kinds of services in the past, they've been on premise, right? Hospital systems have been managed by hospital IT teams inside a hospital. There is some kind of on network, presence control. And now it's just on the internet, single factored, it's just not good enough. And I think it's important that people get that message, and a £6 million fine, it's a pretty clear message.
Yeah, I agree. It sends a clear message, and I think it's a positive thing, right? Yeah. And so what was that? Was the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office. We've got a similar office here in Australia as well. It's a little bit different, excuse me, to how the United States tends to regulate things. A little bit more straightforward, shall we say. This story I love. Zach Whitaker has written it up for TechCrunch. Someone out there has saved 6 ransomware victims from having to pay up by owning the control panels for the ransomware actors. I'm going to tell you why I think this is interesting in a moment, but just walk us through what happened here.
So the security researcher Vangelis Stikis set out to map out a bunch of command and control systems for ransomware projects and the other services behind ransomware crews. And he found some bugs and some, and they're pretty standard kind of stuff, APIs with no authentication, default creds, those sorts of things, and then started monitoring what those crews were attacking. And he found I think 4 organizations that were in the process of being ransomwared. A couple were small companies, a couple were like billion-dollar crypto firms. And then he was able to reach out to them, communicate, warn them what was going on, provide decryption keys in a couple of cases as well. So, bullet dodged for them because of some, internet do-gooder. But on the other hand, there is always some risks at messing with these systems.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I'm curious about here is it looks like some of these bugs that he used involve things like default passwords. Now, if I go out and log into a system with a default password, I mean, I'm committing a crime, right?
You're doing crimes, yes.
So previously, what I find interesting about this is, in years gone by, there would have been a lot of hand-wringing about, oh no, what he did was possibly illegal and interfering with law enforcement operations and yada, yada, yada. Whereas there's none of that really in this story. It's just, here's what he did. So that's what I find interesting about this is I feel like so there's this sort of cyber Overton window on this sort of shenanigans, on these sort of shenanigans, it's actually starting to move a bit.
Yeah, I think people have been doing this for a long time, busting into crime groups and helping themselves to their data, but generally people have kind of kept it quiet for exactly those reasons, because it's always been a bit of a, unclear, murky ground. And the groups that do this at scale, who break into crime organizations and things, have really kept it quiet because it's not worth the grief. But yeah, I think you're right that, opinions, I think, have changed. And we're, seeing hospitals and, cancer patients and, children's hospitals ransomed, it does kind of change how you feel about, the fine print of the law here.
Yeah, I mean, I just wonder, would it be a net positive or a net negative? Given that FBI operations targeting these sorts of groups tends to result in them discovering that most of them are based in Russia, I sort of wonder if, the US Department of Justice saying, issuing a release saying we're not really interested in prosecuting people who do this sort of thing would lead to a flurry of the sort of activity that we live to see, Yeah. What do you think? I mean, is it just time for us to allow, and I'm not talking about letters of marque and mercenary cyber operators going after ransomware crews. What I'm talking about is just the DOJ saying, if you happen to pop shell on ransomware infrastructure, we're not going to charge it. I just wonder what sort of position that would put us in, because often we hear the FBI complaining that sort of thing interferes and disrupts their investigations, but their investigations, their disruptions are great, but their investigations tend to lead to absentee indictments of people based in Russia. And I just sort of think, well, maybe it's time to just, let people have fun.
I mean, when we have seen people go vigilante on the internet, it tends to be a little bit unhinged. Because people, people's motivations vary. Some people want publicity. Some people want to effect change. Some people have a particular issue that they care about, for example, disrupting child sex abuse, which I too do not care for child sex abuse, so that makes sense. But, there's just a plurality of motivations, and some of them are just kind of messy. So
and I think there's differing levels of competence as well, right?
Yes,
so that's the problem.
we
like to think if the DOJ said, oh, we won't charge people for this, then you're just going to wind up with all sorts of idiots coming out of the woodwork and doing unpredictable things and attacking the wrong targets and whatever. So I think there are still reasons to be careful here, but yeah, at the same time, you love to see it, right?
You do. And I don't know that like there isn't a straightforward answer, because we do enjoy a good mess, but
yeah, we do. We love it. We love a bit of chaos. Come on.
We do. Well, yeah, we do. But I mean, the DOJ can't really love chaos. It's not really not their vibe.
But why though? Anyway, let's move on. Now, look, we're going to stay with a bit of a theme around law. There's just been a Fifth Circuit decision in the United States that says that geofence warrants are illegal under the Fourth Amendment. Basically, the reasoning, I think, seems to be that because, Google or whoever has to search through many, many users' data to actually discover, who was in the geofence at a particular time, that is a Fourth Amendment violation of the people who are not actually the targets and whatnot. I've seen a bit of online discourse about this, people saying, well, I don't know, this is a pretty nuclear take from the Fifth Circuit, and they don't necessarily expect it to stand because it has implications beyond geofence warrants. But this is one of those situations where we've got conflicting opinions from US courts. So you wonder, it's just, you have to think this is just going to get kicked up and kicked up and kicked up into higher and higher courts. I mean, some of these geofence warrants, I think, they're used to solve serious crimes. It's like those warrants as well where I can think of it was like some murder a while ago where a cop had a brainwave and requested that Google hand over information on users who'd searched for the victim's address via Google Maps or whatever, and they got a hit from someone who searched for it like 2 weeks earlier. It turned out to be the person who did it. But I guess the point is we're still working out really the rules for this sort of thing, particularly in the United States where they have constitutional protections around this sort of stuff. And yeah, you just wonder where all this is going to go.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's going to have to end up, going, I guess the Supreme Court is next after this, because was it the Fourth Circuit that decided that this kind of search was like a geofence search wasn't a Fourth Amendment violation, and now the Fifth Circuit has. So I guess when you have a disagreement like that, it's going to have to end up getting escalated upwards. And again, right, it's one of these things where we just, this is complicated. There are equities to balance, and, America does have better enshrined protections in some ways than other countries, right? I mean, we in Australia and New Zealand, we don't have that kind of restriction. We have much more kind of nebulous Westminster, common law kinds of things. Whereas, it's much more explicitly stated in the US, which is good. And at the same time, it's just going to have to keep going up until someone can make a call, because it's important that we balance those equities.
I don't know where the next step is for this one. I don't know if this winds up in the Supreme Court, but I think, the point that you raise, right, which is here, the government will just pass a law and say, we're doing this. There's no Fourth Amendment protections to worry about. And, both systems work, right? Both systems have their various advantages. Look, there's another one here. We're going to link through to a piece from The Verge. And this one's a couple of weeks old. We didn't talk about it at the time, but given we're talking about the geofence stuff, I thought it would make sense to lump it in with this discussion. A federal judge in New York's Eastern District has ruled that warrantless searches of the devices of people who are entering the United States from international travel and whatever, warrantless searches of those devices are unconstitutional. And to be honest, that's one where I've always kind of been surprised that they've been able to do that. I always would have thought that would be somewhat of a Fourth Amendment problem. And apparently, this judge in the New York's Eastern District agrees. From here, I think the practical effect of this ruling, at least according to this reporting, is that CBP will just have to stop doing those searches in New York. But again, this is another case where, we're still trying to work out what should be allowed, what's constitutional in the case of the Americans, what's normal. I mean, we have seen some pretty egregious abuses of these types of searches. I can think of cases in Australia and New Zealand, historical cases. They go a long way back. I can't really remember the details, but you'll have someone like who's a member of a criminal organization where police have been trying to get a warrant for their device. The judge says that the conditions for the warrant haven't been satisfied, so they wait until they're going for a holiday in Fiji or something, and they get them at the border and they seize their device, and it's a custom search. So that is an abuse, as far as I'm concerned. That's like a backdoor, that's a backdoor search, and I've always thought that is improper. And, in this case, the guy who was coming in, they had some intelligence that suggested he might have been carrying CSAM and used that to justify the search, but they didn't have a warrant. And, this judge has said, you need warrants for this sort of thing in the future. But, that said, you would think, given that they had that intelligence, they might actually be able to get a warrant. So You know,
yeah.
maybe everybody wins.
You know, it does feel like if you're using these things specifically to circumvent the requirements of having to get a warrant otherwise, you know, that doesn't feel fair. That doesn't feel like the system working as intended. I was surprised, actually, because I would have thought that, as you know, I agree with you. I felt like I am surprised that this is a thing that was not problematic in the US. And I figured it was just because it didn't get used at enough scale for it to kind of, you know, get to the point where people were making a fuss about it. This reporting said they have done more than, what, 250,000 searches since 2018. That's still quite a lot. It's more than I was expecting, because I figured like they must be kind of keeping it for special occasions so that it didn't get taken away from them. And I guess, you know, we are only talking about New York. There's some big airports there, of course. But, you know, the different, like the structure of the US does mean that having different laws all over the country is a little confusing, especially for us outsiders that are used to, you know, country having one kind of
but this is a federal court, though, so I think this will have eventually ramifications beyond just New York. But I'm not a lawyer, man.
Exactly.
You know, I can't 100% say.
And I mean, in the end, you and I are dirty foreigners, so we get the full freedom experience when we fly into the US, regardless.
Yeah, I mean, some of the laws around this, like outside of the US as well, like in Australia, I think the law that they rely, or the regulation or whatever it is that they rely on to inspect people's devices, is that a device is a container, and customs can open any container to look for stuff that shouldn't be coming in. You know, and sometimes this is a really good thing, right? Like if someone where you've got intelligence that someone is, you know, abusing children or whatever, who's just coming back from a trip where that sort of thing happens, they can, you know, search the devices, and sometimes these idiots have these, you know, crimes well catalogued on their camera roll. Right. And bang, you get to put them in prison. So, you know, you got to see it from both sides, right? Like, I don't want my devices searched at a border, but, you know, if giving up that freedom, you know, gets these people put in, but then by that logic, you know, that's sort of getting into, you got nothing to worry about if you've got nothing to hide, and that's not really good either.
Almost so like these issues are hard and complicated.
Yeah. And they also use it to like, look, like if someone's coming in on a tourist visa, for example, they might access a device and look at the calendar and see if there's a whole bunch of business meetings scheduled, right? So, you know, to see if people are satisfying visa requirements, if they're involved in crime, onwards and onwards. But yeah, it's a fraught issue. It's just interesting to see this come up now, I think. Yeah,
it is.
Because it's not like smartphones are new. You know. Anyway, so that concludes the news, you know, the news segment of, you know, various events and happenings. But now we're going to talk through a research wrap. Of course, the Blackhat and Defcon conferences were held last week in Las Vegas in the United States. And, you know, you've been through the coverage and you've picked the research that you want to talk about, right? So this is totally your jam. And the first one, we're going to link through to Lorenzo's write-up over at TechCrunch. The first one we're going to talk about is some really interesting research into 5G, like mobile networks, where you can essentially if I'm reading it correctly, you'll probably tell me that I'm wrong, you can essentially Stingray 5G networks using 5G devices using some baseband flaws. This looks really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, that is a basic summary of one of the bugs that this research group came up with. And so this is a group of researchers from, I think, Pennsylvania State University, and their papers haven't yet been published, and I haven't seen the talk from Blackhat, so I'm going on the reporting on it, and they published a bunch of code on their GitHub that related to their work. But the guts of it is that they wrote some tooling that can inspect 5G mobile stacks, and from that generate this the state machines that they use between the states that the mobile stack goes through, and then given some baseband from mobile phones and some cell site software, extract these states and then compare where you can get them out of state relative to each other between implementations. And as a general approach, that seems really cool because it's a thing you can use in all sorts of complicated protocols. And they demonstrated this on 5G mobile networks and found, as you say, some the ability to Stingray 5G, which is pretty cool, along with a bunch of other interesting bugs. So solid research by the look of it. I'm really interested to see the rest of the papers and stuff when it comes out. But seems like a bit of a step backwards, given that we had such, robust crypto in 4G, and now in 5G we've kind of messed it up again by trying to make things faster and easier.
I mean, you get less these days by doing this to a mobile device, right? Like, you're going to get, I guess, SMS equivalent, whatever the hell they're using for that these days, and you might get voice calls, but you're not going to get anything over like RCS or, any over-the-top encryption is going to defeat that
iMessage or whatever else does make it less valuable. Of course, there's still lots of useful things you can do, but it's not the skeleton key for everything that access to mobile used to be.
Yeah, so you're not going to get email if they're using a modern protocol. You're not going to get web browsing. Like, there's just a lot you're not going to get. Still doesn't. I'm not trying to poo-poo the research. The research is good. I'm just pointing out that these days, like we have encryptions at the app layer now, and that's why.
Which is good,
right?
exactly. This is why.
Now, this one, we've got a couple of really interesting bits of hardware research here. So I think it's, was it Andy Greenberg who wrote this one up for Wired?
Yes, it was. Yes.
Yes. So tell us about this one. This is a AMD bug that looks extremely not great.
Yeah. So this, Andy wrote up some research from IOActive that have been looking at platform security for AMD CPUs. And in particular, they started looking at how system management mode works. So in modern x86 processors, the kernel runs at what they call ring 0, and then if you have a hypervisor, that runs in a privilege level called -1, and beyond that there is a ring -2, which is for system management, and that's where hardware access and control is kind of managed from. And if you can get up into system management mode, you are, better than the hypervisor. You're beyond all security software. You're in a position where you can do anything you want with the platform. And of course, also gives you access to hardware for things like overriding firmware, etc. And there's been flaws that have let you go up into system management mode on Intel side. And IOActive set out to look for the equivalent thing on AMD. And they found a bug where basically they could confuse the processor when it was loading system management mode code into reading attacker supplied input rather than the stuff it was intended to read, and then from there get up code exec up into SMM. And the flaws that they're looking at basically go back 15, 20 years, like since AMD introduced this kind of ring -2 level. And AMD can patch this in firmware on some CPUs. They're not necessarily going to go back and patch it on everything they've ever shipped, of course. So if you're in the position where you've compromised a machine and you want to be there for a very, very long time, and the conversation we had earlier about, how would you do Crowdstrike if you really wanted to make it hurt, getting into a position where you're underneath the hypervisors, you're underneath all the security software, and you can persist by writing down into the firmware in a way that you really can't be thrown out without junking the whole motherboard. Like, that's the sort of bug that we would be very, very scared of. And the fact that it's existed for 20 years, not great.
Yeah, I mean, doing that at scale would be difficult, though, right? So I think that's one thing where the Crowdstrike thing's a little bit different, because that's more like a supply chain attack. I get what you're saying. Like, I 100% get what you're saying, but yeah, these things are a little bit different in my head, at least. You know what I mean?
If you, I guess the way I think about it is there is a bunch of bits of research that if you joined together, like you glued this together, you would be in a position where, if you could brick all AMD data center systems in one that ran Crowdstrike, for example, like join the Crowdstrike bug with escalate SMM, overwrite the firmware so the machine will never boot ever again, bad times.
You've been thinking about this a little bit too much, I think, actually. Remember Scorpio from The Simpsons? Gentlemen, I have the doomsday device. Right? This is you. You need a long-haired cat to stroke when you're talking about that. To match the beard.
You can stroke my beard,
I guess, but. Now, look, this one is my favorite, actually, this week. So, sorry, the 5G one was the other sort of kind of hardware, firmware related one. This one is not. This one is a Windows downgrade attack, which I just wouldn't have thought was possible, right? So we've seen previous attacks against like updaters and whatever, where you can throw previous versions. I think there was one years ago affected a whole bunch of Linux distros where you could throw like old updates at them and get them to essentially downgrade into a vulnerable state. Looks like someone's figured out how to do this with various Windows components, which is surprising. Walk me through this. I want to understand how practical this is, because this shouldn't be happening with Windows, right?
This is sadly practical. This guy, Elon Lviv, looked at how Windows Update worked and went off looking for a downgrade bug. And there's a lot of digital signatures and kind of integrity checking and mechanisms in place to try and make this more complicated. But those mechanisms have all rather evolved over the years, and a whole system, eye on it is probably well overdue. The bug, you're going to groan when I tell you what the actual flaw was. So when you're Windows updating, the Windows Update kind of back-end system gets told by the user interface or the scheduler or whatever else, like, go get the updates. It gets the updates and then it stages them into a particular place, processes all the metadata, and then goes through and applies them. And some of the updates require a reboot. And so it says, like, next time you reboot, here is a list of things you should do. And then you reboot your Windows and it comes up with, oh, you're updating, please don't turn off your system. And sometimes those updates take multiple reboots to apply correctly. And in between those reboot steps, it saves state. And so everything is digitally signed and well authorized, except the little thing that saves state between reboots. So they...
Right. So you can, if you've got system level access, you can modify that and get it to apply a validly signed older update.
Yeah, so you can change which updates are being applied and kind of what state they're in and which parts of it, and cause it to apply old updates. So you can bypass all of the digital signing requirements and basically get to the point where you can roll a machine back years. And then the update system thinks it has applied all of the modern updates, so it won't apply them again. So it's kind of permanent as well. So to roll it back, you basically have to reinstall at this point. So that's terrible. And then he goes one step further, which is, can he use the same set of tricks to escalate up into the like Windows hypervisor components? So Windows in modern, like Windows 11, Windows 10, has a mechanism where it handles credentials in a separate virtual machine, right? There is your main Windows OS, and then there is a separate kind of VM environment that handles privileged operations like credentials, and that's why stealing credentials out of LSAS or modern Windows is difficult. And so he uses the same tricks to apply updates up into these even more privileged contexts, and onwards up into the EFI BIOS even. So he's able to update or downgrade, I guess, his way into the point where you've bypassed secure boot because there's been bugs in that. So you can downgrade that through the same trick. So essentially you're back to, we can bypass secure boot, we can bypass all the hypervisor-based controls, and we can roll back our system to ancient vulnerable versions of everything as an admin.
But I mean, this is post-exploitation activity though, right? Like, it's not remote. The thing that made the Linux stuff like horrible was you could do it remotely, I think.
Yeah, that was because some of the package repository metadata was usually handled over HTTP because it was signed, the files themselves were signed.
Exactly, right? So they'd done all the signing on the update, so why bother with that fancy newfangled TLS stuff, right?
It's expensive, so I think that was on high volume archive servers and blah blah blah. Yeah, so it turned out to not be such a great idea.
Yes. So I mean, this is like post system, right? Compromise. So that's something, but yeah, it's still not great, because you would think that if you want to maintain persistence somewhere, rolling that machine into a vulnerable state, so if you do get evicted and they don't completely reimage the device, you can just come back.
Yep.
You know, that seems handy.
Yes, it certainly does. And like, if it means you can bypass secure boot and some of the other hypervisor-based controls, so like these two bits of research we just talked about, the AMD sync close, and this one, in my mind, if you were the CrowdStrike person, someone who did CrowdStrike for evil, and you wanted to ensure that you maintain access wherever you bricked things, or you kind of got enough access to brick things, getting to the position where you can write to the EFI through a bug, like through being able to downgrade your way like this, like I feel like it lines up pretty well. Like, these things pair nicely. It's a good, it's like the food wine combination of of bugs.
Yes, it's the duck breast with the Pinot Noir.
Exactly.
Yes. So, and it's worth pointing out again that the best attackers in the world are already doing a lot in hardware.
Yes.
Right? Like, this doesn't make the news, but that is something that they are doing. Yeah. And as we know, it's a matter of time. It's just a matter of time before other types of attackers start doing that as well. We are hideously underprepared when it comes to tooling to address these risks, and that's going to be a lot of fun in 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Moving on, and look, I love a bit of research from James Kettle, of course, from Portswigger, and we've got some here that he's presented in Vegas.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the idea that you should watch James Kettle's talk from Vegas is not exactly insightful, like, because he always does great talks, and this one, it's exactly what you expect from him. Really, really interesting bug classes made practical in a way, through Portswigger's tooling, in a way that, takes things that you might read a paper about but never actually use and makes them things that everyone can use. And then he, as always, goes and does them against everyone who has a bug bounty program, because once again, Portswigger, that's how they roll. And it's just wonderful research. This looks at the utility of timing attacks to do all sorts of really, really interesting things, and how to make timing attacks practical in modern web applications through things like HTTP2 pipelining to deliver requests at the same time, and interleaving requests so that you can cause 2 requests to be delivered very, very, very close together in time, taking out network latency, and all those kinds of useful things. So it's pretty detailed. But if you're a web app pen tester, as always, you should read his work and make sure you internalize it and give your customers' applications hell.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the thing about, James Kettle's research, which is that it always winds up working its way into every sort of red teamer and pen testers like workbook eventually, right? So
yeah, just super practical, like really follows that hacker ethos of making the theoretical practical.
Yeah, and we've also got some research here around, the title here says breaching AWS accounts through shadow resources. I did not read this one. I'm sorry, busted. But yeah, tell us about this one.
So this is some research that looked at creating S3 buckets in Amazon AWS that can influence the flow of other tools that store their data in S3. So, for example, if you use Amazon CloudFormation to roll out, to automate deployment of things into your cloud, then it will store some like configuration and stuff that it's going to use into an S3 bucket, and will make one for you if one doesn't exist. And these account names, or these bucket names, are they're not predictable, but if you can find them out in advance, or make them in a different region or something like that, you can influence how these tools consume data. It's kind of logically the same issue as predictable file names in temp on a Unix system, right? You're creating data in a way that trusted processes think they created it and then act upon that data. And they've looked through a number of AWS services where, as an attacker, you can manipulate that, leading upwards to full code exec or account takeover, just basically by guessing an S3 bucket name or determining it in the cases where they are predictably named. And it's the sort of research that, there's so many interesting niches in cloud stuff. Like, there's so many fiddly detail bits that you kind of don't think about how these things actually work. And it's great to see people doing this research. And if you're responsible for cloud systems, like, this mandatory reading, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just blown away by the quality of research this year. There was an awkward time where Blackhat used to be about presenting like memory corruption bugs and research, right? And then all of that kind of went into the defense contracting scene, and people stopped presenting on it, right? So there was this weird lull for a few years in Blackhat research. And of course, now there's all sorts of offensive research that does belong in the public domain. And, getting to see it all presented like this is terrific. We got one more to talk about before we move on to this week's sponsor interview, which looks like some research into Apache, right? Which is, I got to say, that's brave, like targeting one of the giants, going for the king.
Yeah, well, this is Orange Sai, the Taiwanese researcher that, when he decides he's going to do it, it's going to get real. And yeah, he decided he was going to go swing at Apache. And he found some really good bugs, actually. There's some, essentially what he did is he looked at how Apache is made up. So Apache is a kind of core bit, and then a number of modules you plug in to do various things. And the software communicates between those modules using a number of shared kind of data structures. And his rationale was all these modules are written by different people over a very long period of time. And there isn't necessarily a clear consensus about how these data structures should be used. One of the examples would be whether or not a particular path refers to a file path or a URL path when they're being processed. And so he mapped out how all this communication happens and then looked for places where things are used inconsistently. And he ended up coming up with a whole, like half a dozen really solid bugs in Apache in places that you really wouldn't expect them to be, that, lets you read arbitrary files off the file system just by sticking a question mark in the URL in a particular way. So just super great research. I love how he wrote up the rationale and the way he thinks about it, because getting inside that guy's mind, if you're a bug hunter, that's gold right there. So once again, well worth a read if you're a bug hunter. If you're an Apache admin, you're probably going to be applying a few patches.
Yeah. All right. Well, that concludes our research wrap. Thanks a lot for explaining all of that to me, and I'm sure a lot of the listeners found that really, really valuable. So that was great, Adam. And mate, thanks a lot for your time this week. We're going to roll into the sponsor review.
Thanks very much, Pat. I will dig through the rest of the research, because Lord knows there's more of it to come, and maybe we'll do another round next week.
All right, that was Adam Boileau, and it is time for this week's sponsor interview now. This week's show is brought to you by Trail of Bits, which is a security engineering firm. They do all sorts of really interesting work, quite active in the crypto space as well. They can audit all sorts of crypto stuff, and I don't mean just encryption. I do, unfortunately, mean the cryptocurrencies and various crypto instruments. They're also doing a lot of work around AI these days, all sorts of work from model safety through to model security and whatnot. And they're also participating in the DARPA AI Cyber Challenge. And this is where DARPA is running a contest where contestants can essentially, come up with systems that leverage large language models to try to discover vulnerabilities and also figure out how to patch them. So yeah, really interesting stuff. And there was just a round of that contest in Vegas last week. And Dan joined me to talk all about the DARPA AI Challenge. Here he is. I hope you enjoy it.
Yeah, sure. So the DARPA AI Cyber Challenge is a competition to apply AI to bug detection and bug patching systems. DARPA's challenged us to create an automated system that has no human involvement that can find and fix bugs in real software. Things like the Linux kernel, Nginx, Apache Jenkins, or other really large software programs.
Okay, so what's been the general approach then of contestants? Because, there was just the big challenge that happened at Defcon where people got to show off their various approaches to this. How did the contest participants try to go about using AI to do what you just described, right? To find those sorts of vulnerabilities? Because I'd imagine that, there's a lot of ways to skin this cat, right?
Yeah, so the constraints on this challenge were pretty extreme. Like in the DARPA Cyber Grant Challenge, about almost 10 years ago at this point, the challenge projects, the software that we had to audit was very simple. But in this case, because we've been given real software, it's significantly more difficult to find bugs in it. We've also had constraints like you're only allowed to test each piece of software for 4 hours at a time. And we have a dollar limit of how many LLM tokens we're able to use. So we can't just infinitely call out to ChatGPT to get recursive feedback from it about our bug finding. So they really put the constraints on this very, very tight, where we had to come up with something almost magical in order for it to be able to find a bug in a complex piece of software with hardly any analysis time whatsoever. There were a lot of teams that signed up for this. 90 teams attempted to participate. There were 39 teams that created a working, called a cyber reasoning system, or a CRS, that were actually evaluated during this competition. And out of those, 7 were able to find a large enough number of bugs and patch a large enough number of bugs that they're proceeding to the final round that's going to happen next year. And I'm really lucky to say that Trail of Bits was one of them.
So you just mentioned it there. So my question was really about how did people, go about using AI to do these sorts of things? And you said they built, cyber reasoning systems. So what are those? Because that's what I was thinking. I'm like, you're given the rules are you can use AI and LLMs and stuff to do this sort of bug analysis. So, what do you then instruct the LLM to do? Do you sort of keep prompting it until it builds some sort of model of the software, or what's the rough shape of how this works?
Yeah, so from a high level, the way the competition works is you've been given this very tiny little pinhole through which you can see the target software. So there's a function that you can call called run POV, run proof of vulnerability. And that's where you can send input to execute against, say, the Linux kernel or Jenkins. That's the only porthole that you get to test through. So all the other stuff that happens on the other end could be very fuzzing forward, could be very LLM forward. You're basically trying to create inputs. You're generating inputs that could potentially crash or somehow exploit one of those systems. And it's up to all the competitors to figure out how they want to optimize for that. Some teams used a very LLM forward approach. I believe the team, All You Need Is Fuzzing Brain, had one that was almost purely based on LLMs. And then there are teams that were all the way on the other end of the spectrum. I'd say Trail of Bits was a bit more conservative about our use of LLMs, using it as one potential input among many other input generation strategies. So the point of the competition was really to encounter that variety. Like, what are the strategies that work? And that's what DARPA was trying to get at. They're trying to figure out, like, how would you actually use AI to help when finding bugs?
And so what were the approaches in the contest? I mean, you were just there, right? You would have seen which teams went well and had a rough understanding of their approaches. You know, what were the approaches that turned out to be more successful than others? You know, what did we learn through this one, right? Because I'm genuinely curious, because this is all new.
So it's really interesting because there aren't a lot of details out about the challenges yet, or about the CRSs that competed in it yet, because there is a final round coming out in a year. So a lot of the teams are playing their hand close to their chest. And we don't know exactly what these teams did beyond the teeny little one-liners where DARPA congratulated several of the teams during the closing ceremonies. Trail of Bits has been pretty open about some of our details of this. Like, for instance, I have a video up where I talk through our patching strategy. Our patching strategy uses an agent-based approach with LLMs in order to generate what I'd call idiomatic style patches that fit into the program and get feedback from a fuzzer and from testing tools and from other sorts of more like offensive things to see if it actually works to address the bug. But I don't think we're going to find out a lot about exactly what each competitor has done until next year after the finals. And when the finals do happen, we'll find out everything. DARPA has mandated that all of, not just our strategies, but the code that we use to run our CRS has to be open source 2 weeks after the finals run.
Yeah, right. Okay. That makes sense. So just curious though, like the software, I'm guessing they gave you a list of the software that was sort of, that you would be targeting for the challenge. So did you do, like, I imagine you would have done a lot of the testing before you turned up, and that when people arrive, it's just about showing off how their system elicited, vulnerability information out of that system, right?
Yeah, so in fact, most of the challenges that we had to play on during the live competition, we did not see ahead of time. So this was, again, one of these enormous constraints.
Right. Okay. So they give you the parameters of the contest, and then like on the day they're like, okay, today your system is going to be targeting this, and then you get to see how it performs against something that it doesn't know. Because that's what I was wondering. I'm like, how do you actually begin to set up a competition like this so people don't just optimize it to one target or another? And that answers that question.
Yeah. They gave us a couple of what they call exemplar challenges so that we could at least build something and test it, over the last few months. But we had no idea what kind of software they're going to throw in there. We had some idea. We knew that they were partnered with the Linux Foundation. We expected it to be open source software. But, we didn't know it was going to be SQLite. We didn't know that it was going to be Apache Tika. We didn't know a whole lot of different targets for this. And our systems, luckily enough, especially for the 7 people that qualified, were robust enough to deal with that. So given an unknown target, set up a whole fuzzing harness automatically, find bugs in it, patch bugs in it, identify the commit that introduced the bug, and prove that you understand what the bug was. Submit with your report what type of bug you've discovered, and all of that using AI and some fuzzing.
So I'm guessing that kind of answers my approach, my question about the approach that I had earlier, which is that, you're using AI to set up a fuzzer, basically, to configure a fuzzing harness or whatever you call it.
Yeah, it could be. Again, there's a variety of approaches that teams can take. Some can be more LLM heavy, some cannot, and it's sort of within these constraints. I think it's actually created a diversity of approaches that I don't know if the competition organizers even expected. It does sound like the 7 people that qualified had very different takes on what was required to do this.
Now, the big question, right, which is, what did you find when you sat down to go against, SQLite or whatever, using your approach in the contest? I know you've been working on this for some time, so did you manage to find any bugs? And, what was the nature of the bugs? Were they exploitable? Were they just like, DOS conditions or, logic bugs? How did that all work? What did you find? Tell us what you found.
Yeah, absolutely. So these bugs were inserted into the programs. They're synthetic bugs that were created by the competition organizers. Except for one case where we did, not we, Team Atlanta, which I believe is Georgia Tech, their CRS was able to identify a bug in SQLite that was not part of the competition, which was a live bug in the SQLite
Yeah.
code base.
This happened at God, what was it? It was an Australian. It was either a training event or a conference, I think, or a CTF, or I think it was a CTF in Australia, where a bunch of kids turned up and like found a whole bunch of like ODE in the networking equipment by accident because they thought it was part of the competition. I love it when that happens. So good.
Yeah, totally. So, in the Linux kernel, Nginx, and SQLite, those are three challenge projects that were written in the C language. We had to find 5 different CWEs, so things like out of bounds reads, integer overflows, use after freeze, null pointer dereferences, and out of bounds writes. So we were lucky because this occurred in rounds where we did 1 target per round, and the very first one was Nginx, and Trail of Bits' CRS came out of the gate pretty strong. We immediately found and fixed, I believe, 6 different bugs that put us sort of in the lead for the CRSs that were there. A lot of these other, targets ended up being really difficult for a variety of reasons. Java, if you've ever had to test a Java application, just has massive numbers of dependencies that take a long time to compile and work with. The Linux kernel is just massive. And beyond being massive, a lot of the bugs are hidden like 10 layers down, and it can be very difficult for an LLM or a fuzzer to reach one of those points where a vulnerability might lie. So we saw a lot
I'm
less
guessing this is why DARPA would have picked it for the challenge, right? There's no point giving people an easy challenge. It's got to be hard, right? And that's going to be hard. Both of those things, like sending an LLM, giving it a map and a compass and sending it off into Java land, it's going to get eaten by bears, man.
Yeah, I do admire that we have real targets this time around. The CGC back 10 years ago with the more synthetic, simpler testing system, we know how to find bugs in real software today. So I think it's a good bar to set as we think about continuing to design automated vulnerability detection tools in the future.
I guess what you're saying, though, is that they've had the round of this competition in Vegas and that so far, the results are encouraging, right? People were actually able to demonstrate that their systems performed. They were able to actually identify the vulnerabilities that DARPA had inserted in there. Even, there was a team that even turned up one that they didn't put up in there. So, I guess, look, with all of these things, and particularly these DARPA challenges, right? What usually happens is by the end of them, you're sort of left with the impression that, further study is required, right? Like, it's not going to be like, wow, this is a panacea for vuln research, and it's not going to be, this is a complete dead end. It's always going to be one of those situations where, LLMs and AI tech is just going to be one more tool in the toolbox, right, for doing vuln discovery. Is that about how you're expecting this to shake out?
So I do think that the likelihood that this results in an immediately usable tool after the competition is higher than average for a DARPA program. They're making us produce direct information that proves that we have a bug. In order to score points, we have to produce a patch. In order to produce a patch, we have to understand the bug. In order to produce a patch, we have to identify the commit that introduced the bug. And all of that taken together, focused on a real piece of, or demonstrated on a real piece of software, means the likelihood is high that these things could actually be helpful in a year. So I'm, from a Trail of Bits perspective, this is not the only entry that we have into this field. We're putting a lot more energy behind our automated vulnerability detection tools that use LLMs and use generative AI, because I think it shows a lot of promise, and I want to make sure we're out in front. I think we've learned a lot about how to engineer software with AI that produces good results, and that's going to pay off for a lot of other activities that Trail of Bits invests in, and the way that we consult with our clients about their own use of AI.
All right. Well, Dan Guido, thank you so much for joining us on Risky Business to have a chat about the DARPA AI Challenge and the round that was just held at Vegas. I guess we'll chat again in about a year and find out how it all went. Yep. Looking forward to it. Thanks. That was Dan Guido there with this week's sponsor interview. Big thanks to him for that, and big thanks to Trail of Bits for sponsoring this week's show. I've linked through to Dan's blog post about the AI Cyber Challenge in the show notes for this episode. And yeah, that's about going to wrap up this week's edition of the Risky Business Podcast. Thanks a lot for joining us. And until next week, I've been Patrick Gray. Thanks for listening.